Excellent. Well, good morning and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris. I'm the lead pastor here at Hoboken Grace, and I have to admit to you something. I love speaking after that music. I love it. 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 And for those of you who don't know, we are in this conversation called Fearless, and we have been looking at a dream that we've been given by the one that we follow. It's found in 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4:18. We've been looking at this passage for the past couple of weeks. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. And from the first week of this conversation, we've been looking at this verse and asking, okay, God, how do we live like that? How do we live in such a way that your love, that perfect love, casts out or drives out all fear? Is it actually possible? What does it look like to live a life, that's not shaped by fear? And the reality is that it really doesn't matter what your background is. For all of us, we struggle with fear. And fear is one of those voices that shows up in the decision-making process in our lives over and over and over again, sometimes so loud that we can't drown it out. And it begins to direct us in who we will become and the life that we will live. But then God comes in and says, no, you can live where you control fear instead of fear controlling you. Where fear can actually play the role that it was created to play in your life as an alarm system and nothing more. It does not dictate your future. It does not shape who you become. And for the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at how God is leading us into that, beginning with this idea of punishment and this beautiful truth that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you've been, it doesn't matter what you've done, that Jesus Christ has made it possible for you to have a relationship with God in which you never have to be afraid of Him again. Because of the fact that He's taken all of the punishment that we deserve, He's made it possible for you, as the book of Hebrews says, for you to be able to walk directly into God's presence without fear, because of what Christ has done for you and this amazing gift that Jesus Christ has made available to us. And then we built on that and looked at how God is calling us to experience His power, that God not only wants us to know that He's for us, but He wants us to know that His incredible power in our lives. And we looked at this truth that according to our faith, it'll be done unto us. According to our faith, we're going to experience God's power in our lives. And as we follow Him, especially in those times where we follow Him and it doesn't look like it's going to make sense, especially in those times where we follow Him even though we're not sure how this is going to work out, that we experience God's power in our lives, and that begins to drive out fear, not just that He's for us, but His incredible power to work and move in our lives and the world around us. And then last week we reinforced that. We reinforced that as we looked at the promise that God's given you, that it doesn't matter what you walk into. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad. It doesn't matter if it was meant for evil or if it was meant for good, that He's going to use it for your best. That He's going to use it to draw you to Him, that He's going to use it for you to become like Christ, for the fruit of His Spirit to explode in your life, that what you crave most, God is working in everything in your life to bring that into your experience with Him. This beautiful promise that He's given us. And for many of us, we're beginning to see, okay, God, this could actually be possible. And the thing that is really exciting for me is that many of you are looking at, okay, how do I put this in practice? And you're beginning to push yourself. You're beginning to challenge yourself to live this out, to actually live like you're forgiven. So you go to Him, not just on your good days, but even in your worst moments, to live like you're forgiven, to live like He's powerful, to follow Him in faith. And for so many of you, you're experiencing God's power in your life because of the fact that you're following Him in faith. And it was great last week, just the conversations that took place throughout the week of people who are allowing God into pains that they've been keeping from Him and allowing Him to do in that pain what only He can do, and to bring from that pain what only He can bring from it. And so it's incredibly encouraging to see people taking those steps. And for so many of you, you're not just, if you remember back in week one I asked you to turn to the person next to you and say, I don't have to be afraid anymore. And you remember you said it like you didn't believe it. And I told you there was integrity in that because you didn't believe it. The thing that's really exciting is some of you are beginning to believe it. You're beginning to believe that it might actually be possible to put fear in the place that it belongs, to live a fearless life. And today as we come together, we're actually coming together for the last formal conversation in this fearless series. I'll explain what I mean by that when we come to the end here. But as we come together today, I want to take you to one last passage. And it's actually the context of the passage we've been looking at the whole time, because I think there's still one missing piece to this puzzle. I think there's still one missing piece to how God is leading us out of fear. And one more crucial step or one more crucial idea that we have to understand if we're going to actually live this, if this is going to become our reality. And I think it's actually found in the context of the verse we've been looking at this entire time. So it's actually found in the context of 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. As you look at the verses that come before it, I think that the writer John is doing something amazing in how he's calling us out of fear. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to take you back to the beginning of John's thought process. So as you look at verse 18, it's inside of a thought process. I want to take you back to the beginning of it. It actually begins in verse 7. So before we get to 4:18, we're going to jump up to 4:7. 1 John 4:7. He starts off like this. He says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." And he begins this thought process with this big idea that, listen, when you have been loved, you love. When you've been loved, you love. When you've been loved by God, you love. That's just the way it is. He says, as a matter of fact, if you don't love, you have to ask yourself whether or not you've been loved. And so he starts off with this big idea, and then he begins to walk them through it, and he breaks it down a couple different times. He's really just saying the same thing over and over again, but in different ways. So listen to him as he continues. He says, "This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins." He says, let me break this down for you. Let me just point out for you. This is how God loved us. Love didn't start with us. This is how God loved us. This is how Jesus gave his life for us. And he's calling us back to look at how you have been loved. And then he says, "Dear friends, since God loved us so, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us." He says, this is how we've been loved by God. So again, those who love, love. So in response to that, we should love those around us. And the truth is, we don't have the opportunity. This is what he's saying here. He says, we don't have the opportunity to show people God's face, but we can show people God's love. He says, no one's ever seen God. He says, but if we love, God is in us, and people are able to see God's love through us. We can't show him his face, but we can show him or show them his love. And then he continues and he says something very interesting, and this is crucial to the entire passage. He continues and he says, when you do that, he says, and his love is made complete in us. He says, when you do that, when you love others, you complete God's love. Now, this is a very difficult passage, and translators struggle with this passage. They struggle with it because there's really no English equivalent to this Greek word. As a matter of fact, if you read the three most popular English translations, the three most used English translations, no two translations translate it the same way. So if you read it, this is the NIV, it says that his love is made complete in us. If you read it in the New American Standard Bible, it says that his love is perfected in us. If you read it in the New Living Translation, it says that his love is brought to its fullness in us. It's very interesting. They can't figure out which word actually captures it the best. And I don't know if they intentionally just went with the three possibilities, but they all went with different possibilities. And they're trying to capture this idea. One of the things one of the reasons why they struggle with it is because how could you possibly add to God's love? And sometimes people misunderstand this passage and they say, well, you perfect God's love, you add to God's love. That's ridiculous. He's not saying that God's love is incomplete or insufficient in some way. He's actually calling us to something that Jesus worked incredibly hard for his disciples to understand, and that is this. It's better to give than to receive. It's better to love than to be loved. What he's saying here isn't that God's love is lacking in some way, shape, or form, and you have to complete it or fulfill it or perfect it in the way that we would normally talk about it. What he's saying is the completion of the process. The climax of this whole thing is not in what you're going to receive, but in what you're going to give. He says, when you give away God's love, that's when you actually experience it to its fullness. That's when you actually experience all that it was meant to be. God's love is never meant to be something that's simply received. It's always meant to be something that's given. And the greatest joy and the greatest experience of that love is found when you give it. And so he says that when you love one another, not only is it that those who have been loved, love, he said, but when you love, you actually complete, or you experience the completion of, the fullness of, the climax of God's love. And then he continues. That word is very important. Keep that with you, because we're going to come back to it as we work through this. He says, God lives in us and his love is made complete in us. We know that we live in him and he is in us because he has given us his Spirit. And we have seen and testified that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. If anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in him and he is in God. And so we know and rely on the love that God has for us. And then he goes back to God's love for us and he says, and we know that we have this love because we see God's Spirit working in our lives. And we see how he's working and moving in our lives. And we've seen what he did with Christ. And so we know this. We've experienced this. And then he continues and says, God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in him. In this way, love is made complete. And he comes back to that word again, right? It says, in this way, love is made complete among us. Why does he say among us? Because this is something as we're loving one another. This is something we do together, not individually. He says, but as we're loving one another, again, his love is made complete. That same word, complete, perfect, brought to its fullness, right? It says it's being made complete in us so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment, because in this world we are like him. Now let me break this down for you, because this passage can be really misunderstood. So he comes to this and he says, as we're loving one another in this way, his love is made complete among us so that we will have confidence. Now, what is John saying there? Is he saying that if you're a loving person, then because of your works, you can have confidence? Is he saying that? Well, everything else that John writes goes against that idea. Because we know that John believes, as Paul did, that salvation is by grace through faith, not of works, lest anyone should boast. An arrogant Christian is a foolish Christian. They don't understand what God's done for them. Our relationship with God is never based on our works. And this idea that we would have confidence, you pay very close attention to this. Whenever you're reading through the Scriptures and you hear the Bible calling you, the Scriptures calling you to have confidence, or to take courage, one of the things that you can know is this: it is never going to be based on you. It's never going to be based on you. It's never going to be based on your strength or your ability or your skill or whatever it may be. It's never going to be based on you. Whenever we're called to have confidence, it's based on him. And what John's trying to help us understand here is this. When you love each other this way, when you decide to follow God and to, as you're experiencing his love, to give it to others, it says, then you're going to actually grow in exactly what we've been talking about. When you love this way, when you begin to love people this way, you grow in your confidence of God's forgiveness. You grow in your confidence of God's forgiveness. If you've ever gone out of your way to love someone unconditionally, you have grown in your confidence of God's forgiveness because you become incredibly aware. The more you try to love people unconditionally, the more aware you are of the fact that God should destroy you because you want to destroy them. The more that you try to love people this way, the more confident you grow in God's forgiveness. You also grow in confidence of God's forgiveness because you see, I can't believe God continues to use me even though I continue to fail. You grow in your confidence of God's forgiveness. You grow in your confidence of God's power. Why? Because you see him show up over and over again as your loving people. You also grow in his confidence that he can take, whether it's good or bad, and use it for your best. The reason that this develops confidence is not because, oh, look what I've done. The reason that it develops confidence is that when you're loving the way that Christ loves, God's presence becomes more and more and more real in your life, and you become more and more like him, which is what, remember what we talked about last week? What was the point of what God's doing in your life? That you would be like Christ. And so you grow more and more like him, which develops your confidence, not because of who you are, but because you see God working and moving, and it develops this incredible confidence in who he is and what he's doing and what he's going to do as you continue on this journey with him. And this is the context for verse 18. And so he finally comes to our memory verse where he says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. And this is where John does something really cool. John does something really cool. He comes in and he twists a word just a little bit. And he gives it two meanings. And he's been setting you up through this whole conversation to just give you a little twist at the end. And it comes when he gets to verse 18. Because as he gets to verse 18, he says, but perfect love. Now, it's difficult to pick this up in the English translations because, again, they use all different words to capture the same root word. As you read through this passage, every time you see complete, perfect, brought to fullness, it all comes from the same root word. So when you're reading it in the original letter, if you look at it in Greek, you see that it's showing up throughout this conversation. And he gets to the end, and he says, but perfect love drives out fear. Now, when you hear that, when I hear that, the first time you hear that, what do you think of immediately? Well, perfect love, that's Christ's love. Christ's love. Perfect love drives out fear. Well, Christ's love drives out fear. And I think he wants it to mean that and what he's been setting up through the whole conversation. And I think that he uses the word that he uses so that it can capture both. He uses this word that could be complete, perfect, because he knows that when you hear it, you're immediately going to think of God's love, which is true. He's saying, yes, God's love drives out fear. But there's another side of that, which is this. It's not your experience of God's love that drives out fear. It's perfect love. Well, what is perfect love? He's been talking to us about it the entire time. It's the love that you give away. He said, he's been setting this whole thing up using this same word so that when you got to this, you would realize, okay, what is the love that drives out fear? He's saying it's not just the love that you experience. It's the love that you give. which is why the end of the verse makes sense. If you take the verse out of context, the end of the verse doesn't make sense, because he says, the one who fears is not made perfect in love. What does that mean? That I just haven't experienced God's love enough? No. It's that you're not giving it away yet. How are you made perfect by love? It's the practice of giving it away. He said the reason you're still afraid is because you're just experiencing God's love. You're not giving it away. And so in not giving it away, you're falling short of the fullness of the love that God wants you to experience. And it's going to leave you in fear. 1 John chapter 4 is not about fear. It's about love. The whole passage is about love. But God understands that you can't love well if you continue to be afraid. So what does he tell you to do? He says, if you want to leave fear behind, you got to love. You have to live to love. And he says, if you do that, it will drive out fear. And as you live to love, it will drive out fear. Which I respond to with this. That's a catch-22. That's a catch-22. Because you want me to love, to not be afraid and love, but the way for me to not be afraid is to love. How in the world do you do that? And I remember I was having a conversation with someone, it was about a year ago, and they were talking to me about relationships, and they said I just struggle to love because I don't feel like I can trust people. I don't feel like I can trust the people around me. And we were talking through this, and she's like, okay, if I love, it will cast out fear, but what's keeping me from loving is fear. So how do I overcome the fear before? And you're caught in this catch-22, and how does this work? And she said, it really doesn't even matter who it is. I don't trust people, so how do I love? And I told her a story. It was one of these moments in my life that just it really shifted my whole perspective on life. I was having a conversation with one of my mentors, and it was me and a couple of other guys, and we were talking to him about relationships, and he said something to me that I'll never forget. He said, you guys should know, I don't trust my wife. And we said, well, okay, that's probably not good. And as he continued, he said, not only do I not trust my wife, but when you guys get married, I think it's really important that you don't trust your wife either. We're thinking to ourselves, maybe we should find someone else to ask advice from. Maybe this isn't the right person. But he always kind of worked off of shock, so we gave him a little bit of leeway and pushed into it a little bit. I said, well, what do you mean you don't trust your wife? And he said, well, let me give you a challenge. He said, what I want you to do is I want you to go into the next week, and I want you to spend the week. You can research it, talk to as many people as you can, read as much as you can. He said, I want you to find me one place in the scriptures where God asks you to trust another person. I want you to find me where God asks you to trust another person. We thought we were pretty smart. We thought we knew the Bible pretty well. And so we said, all right, we'll take that challenge. We went into that next week. We came back. You know how many times in the scriptures God asks you to trust another person? Not one. Not one time. He said, I don't trust my wife because we're broken people. He said, she's going to hurt me. She's going to let me down at some point. And typically, the way we handle relationships, the way that we look at love is that it's based on trust. So I'm going to love you as long as I can trust you. But we are broken people. And no matter how much you love your wife, no matter how much your wife loves you, no matter how much you love your friend, no matter how much your friend loves you, they are going to, at some point, break that trust. And when that happens, the love will change. If it's based on the way you trust the other person. He says, God doesn't ask you to love because you trust people. He says he asks you to love because you trust him. God never asks you to love because you trust the other person. He asks you to love because you trust him. And so you trust him that even if she lets you down, even if he breaks the trust, that he's going to use it for your best. You trust him. God only calls you to trust one person, and that's him. And as John comes to us, he says, listen, God's calling us to be like him. And when you've been loved, you love. And the completion of that love is not when you receive it, but when you give it away. And if you will love like that, it will drive fear out. But we don't love because we trust people. We don't love because they love us. 1 John chapter 4, verse 19. The verse that follows our memory verse is this: we love because he first loved us. And he reaches the end of the conversation. He says, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to love because you trust him and because he loved you first. Not because you trust them or because they're going to love you back. We don't love because we trust. We don't love because of what we're going to receive. We don't love because they're going to appreciate it. We don't love because we think that it will be reciprocated. We don't love because it's safe. We love because he first loved us. And in faith, we know that it's better to give than to receive. In faith, we know that it's in loving others and in taking his love and giving it away that we bring to the fullness his love in the world around us. In faith, we know that as we do that, we will grow in confidence as we watch him move and work in our lives. In faith, we know that as we do that, it will drive out fear. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Look at how he's loved and love. Love well. May we be the people who bring the fullness of God's love to the world around us, because we live fearlessly and we love courageously. Will you pray with me? Father, I love how you, in this passage, how you walk us through this. and the beauty of how you introduce this truth of the power of giving away your love and all that it does in our lives and all that it brings into our lives. And Father, I pray today for those who are here, I pray that they would, in faith, commit to following you and what you're calling us to. Father, I pray for those who are here who need to take a step in trusting you, that you've made it possible for them to be forgiven, that they can actually have this relationship with you. Father, I pray that they would trust you in that they would come to you in that they would give their life to you and know that they don't have to be afraid of you. That they would accept your forgiveness. I pray for those who are experiencing a limited amount of your power because they're not following you in faith, that they're saying no. I pray that this would be the day that they declare to follow you no matter what, that they would say yes. I pray for those who have run from you because of the pain and have not experienced what you can bring out of that in their lives. I pray that they would run back to you and allow you to work in that and through that. Father, I pray that as we move forward, conversation, I pray that as we move forward from this place in this conversation, that we would be dedicated to fearlessly loving. That we would give our lives to fearlessly loving, knowing that as we do, it will drive fear. It will drive fear from our lives. Father, we thank you in Jesus' name.